History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 3 Byzantium and its Sphere. The appearance of the Venetian challenge and the persistence of the old ones would have been embarrassing enough for the Byzantine emperors had they not also faced new trouble at home. In the 12th century, revolt became more common. This was doubly dangerous when the West was entering upon enterprise in the East in the great and complex movement, which is famous as the Crusades. The Western view of the Crusades need not detain us here. From Byzantium, these eruptions from the West looked more and more like new barbarian invasions. In the 12th century, they left behind 4 crusading states in the former Byzantine Levant, as a reminder that there was now another rival in the field in the Near East. When the Muslim forces rallied under Saladin, and there was a resurgence of Bulgarian independence at the end of the 12th century, the great days of Byzantium were finally over. The fatal blow came in 1204, when Constantinople was at last taken and sacked, but by Christians, not the pagans who had threatened it so often. A Christian army which had gone east to fight the infidel in the Fourth Crusade was turned against the empire by the Venetians. It terrorized and pillaged the city. This was when the bronze horses of the hippodrome were carried off to the stand, and as they did until lately in front of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, and enthroned a prostitute in Patriarch's seat in St. Sophia. East and West could not have been more brutally distinguished. The sack, denounced by the Pope, was to live in Orthodox memory as one of infamy. The Franks, as the Greeks called them, all too evidently did not see Byzantium as a part of their civilization, nor perhaps as even a part of Christendom, for a schism had existed in effect for a century and a half. Though they were to abandon Constantinople and the emperors would be restored in 1261, the Franks would not again be cleared from the old Byzantine territories until a new conqueror came along, the Ottoman Turk. Meanwhile, the heart had gone out of Byzantium, though it had still 2 centuries in which to die. The immediate beneficiaries were the Venetians and Genoese, to whose history the wealth and commerce of Byzantium was now annexed. The legacy of Byzantium, or a great part of it, was on the other hand already secured to the future, though not perhaps in a form in which the Eastern Roman would have felt much confidence or pride. It lay in the rooting of Orthodox Christianity among the Slav peoples. This was to have huge consequences, many of which we still live with. The Russian state and the other modern Slav nations would not have been incorporated into Europe and would not have been reckoned as part of it if they had not been converted to Christianity in the first place. Much of the story of how this happened is still obscure, and what is known about the Slavs before Christian times is even more debatable. Though the ground plan of the Slav peoples of today was established at roughly the same time as that of Western Europe, geography makes for confusion. Slav Europe covers a zone where nomadic invasions and the nearness of Asia still left things very fluid long after barbarian society had settled down in the West. Much of the Central and Southeastern European landmass is mountainous. There, river valleys channeled the distribution of stocks. Most of modern Poland and European Russia, on the other hand, is a vast plain, though for a long time covered in forests. It provided neither obvious natural lodgements nor insuperable barriers to settlements. In its huge spaces, rights were disputed for many centuries. By the end of the process, at the beginning of the 13th century, there had emerged in the East a number of Slav peoples who would have independent historical futures. The pattern thus set has persisted down to our own day. There had also come into existence a characteristic Slav civilization, though not all Slavs belonged wholly to it. And in the end, the peoples of Poland and the modern Czech and Slovak republics were to be more closely tied by culture to the west than to the east. The state structures of the Slav world would come and go, but two of them, those evolved by the Polish and Russian nations, proved particularly tenacious and capable of survival in organized form. They would have much to survive, for the Slav world was at times, notably in the 13th and 20th centuries, under pressure as much from the west as from the east. Western aggressiveness is another reason why the Slavs retained a strong identity of their own. The story of the Slavs has been traced back at least as far as 2000 BC, when this ethnic group appears to have been established in the eastern Carpathians. For 2000 years, they spread slowly, both west and east, but especially to the east into modern Russia. From the 5th to the 7th century AD, Slavs from both the western and eastern groups began to move south into the Balkans. Perhaps their direction reflects the power of the Avars, the Asiatic people who, after the ebbing of the Hun invasions, lay like a great barrier across the Don, Dnieper and Dniester valleys, controlling South Russia as far as the Danube and courted by Byzantine diplomacy. Throughout their whole history, the Slavs have shown remarkable powers of survival. Harried in Russia by Scythians and Goths, in Poland by Avars and Huns, they nonetheless stuck to their lands and expanded them. They must have been tenacious agriculturalists. Their early art shows a willingness to absorb the culture and techniques of others. They learned from masters whom they outlasted. It was important, therefore, that in the 7th century there stood between them and the dynamic power of Islam a barrier of two peoples, the Khazars and the Bulgars. These strong peoples also helped to channel the gradual movement of Slavs into the Balkans and down to the Aegean. Later it was to run up the Adriatic coast and was to reach Moravia and Central Europe, Croatia, Slovenia, and Serbia. By the 10th century, Slavs must have been numerically dominant throughout the Balkans. In this process, the first Slav state to emerge was Bulgaria. Though the Bulgars were not Slavs, but stemmed from tribes left behind by the Huns. Some of them gradually became Slavicized by intermarriage and contact with the Slavs. These were the Western Bulgars, who were established in the 7th century on the Danube. They cooperated with the Slav peoples in a series of great raids on Byzantium. In 559, they had penetrated the defenses of Constantinople and camped in the suburbs. Like their allies, they were pagans. Byzantium exploited differences between Bulgar tribes, and a ruler from one of them was baptized in Constantinople, the Emperor Heraclius, standing godfather. He used the Byzantine alliance to drive out the Avars from what was to be Bulgaria. Gradually, the Bulgars were diluted by Slav blood and influence. When a Bulgar state finally appears at the end of the century, we can regard it as Slav. In 716, Byzantium recognized its independence. Now, an alien body existed on territory long taken for granted as part of the empire. Though there were alliances, this was a thorn in the side of Byzantium, which helped to cripple her attempts to recover in the west. At the beginning of the 9th century, the Bulgars killed an emperor in the battle and made a cup of their king's from the skull. No emperor had died on campaign against the barbarians since 378. A turning point, though not the end of conflict, was reached when the Bulgars were converted to Christianity. After a brief period during which, significantly, he dallied with Rome and the possibility of playing it off against Constantinople, another Bulgarian prince accepted baptism in 865. There was opposition among his people, but from this time, Bulgaria was Christian. Whatever diplomatic gain Byzantine statesmen may have hoped for, it was far from the end of their Bulgarian problem. Nonetheless, it is a landmark, a momentous step in a great process, the Christianizing of the Slav peoples. It was also an indication of how this would happen, from the top downwards, by the conversion of their rulers. What was at stake was a great prize, the nature of the future Slav civilization. Two great names dominate the beginning of its shaping, those of the brothers Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. Priests still had it in honor in the Orthodox communion. Cyril had earlier been on a mission to Khazaria, and their work must be set in the overall context of the ideological diplomacy of Byzantium. Orthodox missionaries cannot neatly be distinguished from Byzantine diplomatic envoys, and these churchmen would have been hard put to it to recognize such a distinction. But they did much more than convert a dangerous neighbor. Cyril's name is commemorated still in the name of the Cyrillic alphabet which he devised. It was rapidly diffused through the Slav peoples, soon reaching Russia, and it made possible not only the radiation of Christianity but the crystallization of Slav culture. That culture was potentially open to other influences, for Byzantium was not its only neighbor, but Eastern Orthodoxy was in the end the deepest single influence upon it. From the Byzantine point of view, a still more important conversion was to follow, though not for more than a century. In 860, an expedition with 200 ships raided Byzantium. The citizens were terrified. They listened tremblingly in Saint Sophia to the prayers of the patriarch. A people has crept down from the north. The people is fierce and has no mercy. Its voice is as the roaring sea, a fierce and savage tribe, destroying everything, sparing nothing. It might have been the voice of a Western monk invoking divine protection from the sinister longships of the Vikings, and understandably, so for Viking in essence these raiders were. But they were known to the Byzantines as Rus, and the raid marks the tiny beginnings of Russia's military power. As yet, there was hardly anything that could be called a state behind it. Russia was still in the making. Its origins lay in an amalgam to which the Slav contribution was basic. The East Slavs had over the centuries dispersed over much of the upper reaches of the river valleys which flow down to the Black Sea. This was probably because of their primitive agricultural practice of cutting and burning, exhausting the soil in 2 or 3 years, and then moving on. By the 8th century, there were enough of them for there to be signs of relatively dense inhabitation, perhaps of something that could be called town life, on the hills near Kiev. They lived in tribes whose economic and social arrangements remain obscure, but this was the basis of future Russia. We do not know who their native rulers were, but they seem to have lived in the defended stockades, which were the first towns exacting tribute from the surrounding countryside. Onto these Slav tribes fell the impact of Norsemen, who became their overlords or sold them as slaves in the south. These Scandinavians combined trade, piracy, and colonization, stimulated by land hunger. They brought with them important commercial techniques. great skills in navigation and the management of their longships, formidable fighting power, and it seems no women. Like their Viking cousins in the Humber and the Seine, they used the Russian rivers much longer and deeper to penetrate the country which was their prey. Some went right on. By 846, we hear of the Varangians, as they were called, at Baghdad. One of their many sallies in the Black Sea was that to Constantinople in 860. They had to contend with the Khazars to the east and may have first established themselves in Kiev, one of the Khazar tributary districts, but Russian traditional history begins with their establishment in Novgorod, the home garder of Nordic saga. Here, it was said, a prince called Rurik had established himself with his brothers in about 860. By the end of the century, another Varangian prince had taken Kiev and transferred the capital of a new state to that town. The appearance of a new power caused consternation but provoked action by Byzantium. Characteristically, its response to a new diplomatic problem was cast in ideological terms. There seems to have been an attempt to convert some Rus to Christianity, and one ruler may have succumbed. But the Varangians retained their northern paganism. Their gods were Thor and Woden, while their Slav subjects, with whom they were increasingly mingled, had their own gods, possibly of very ancient Indo European origins. In any case, these deities tended to merge as time passed. Soon there were renewed hostilities with Byzantium. Oleg, a prince of the early 10th century, again attacked Constantinople while the fleet was away. He is said to have brought his own ships ashore and to have put them on wheels to outflank the blocked entrance to the Golden Horn. However, he did it. He was successful in extracting a highly favorable treaty from Byzantium in 911. This gave the Russians unusually favorable trading privileges and made clear the enormous importance of trade in the life of the new principality. Half a century or so after the legendary Rurik, it was a reality, a sort of river federation centered on Kiev and linking the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was pagan, but when civilization and Christianity came to it, would be because of easy access to Byzantium, which water gave to the young principality, which was first designated as Rus in 945. Its unity was still very loose. An incoherent structure was made even less rigid by the Vikings' adoption of a Slav principle, which divided an inheritance. Rus princes tended to move around as rulers, among the centers of which Kiev and Novgorod were the main ones. Nevertheless, the family of Kiev became the most important. During the first half of the 10th century, the relation between Byzantium and Kiev Rus was slowly ripening. Below the level of politics and trade, a more fundamental reorientation was taking place as Kiev relaxed its links with Scandinavia and looked more and more to the south. Varangian pressure seems to have been diminishing, and this may have had something to do with the success of Norsemen in the west, where one of their rulers, Rollo, had been granted in 911 land later to be known as the Duchy of Normandy. Yet it was a long time before there were closer ties between Kiev and Byzantium. One obstacle was the caution of Byzantine diplomacy, still quite as concerned in the early 10th century to fish in troubled waters by negotiating with the wild tribes of the Pechenegs as to placate the Rus whose territories they harried. The Pechenegs had already driven to the west the Magyar tribes, which had previously formed a buffer between the Rus and the Khazars, and more trouble could be expected there. Nor did Varangian raids come to an end. though there was something of a turning point when the Rus fleet was driven off by Greek fire in 941. A treaty followed which significantly reduced the trading privileges granted 30 years earlier. But the reciprocity of interests was emerging more clearly as the Khazaria declined and the Byzantines realized that Kiev might be a valuable ally against Bulgaria. Signs of contact multiplied. Varangians appeared in the royal guard at Constantinople, and Rus merchants came there more frequently. Some are believed to have been baptized. Christianity, though sometimes despising the merchant, has often followed the trader's wares. There was already a church in Kiev in 882, and it may have been there for foreign merchants, but nothing seems to have followed from this. There is little evidence of Russian Christianity until the middle of the next century. Then, in 945, the widow of a Kievan prince assumed the regency on behalf of his successor, her son. This was Olga. Her son was Svatoslav, the first prince of Kiev to bear a Slav and not a Scandinavian name. In due course, Olga made a state visit to Constantinople. She may have been secretly baptized a Christian before this, but she was publicly and officially converted on this visit in 957, the emperor himself attending the ceremonies in St. Sophia. Because of its diplomatic overtones, it is difficult to be sure exactly how to understand this event. Olga had, after all, also sent to the west for a bishop to see what Rome had to offer. Furthermore, there was no immediate practical sequel. Svatoslav, who reigned from 962 to 972, turned out to be a militant pagan, like other Viking military aristocrats of his time. He clung to the gods of the north and was doubtless confirmed in his belief by his success in raiding Khazar lands. He did less well against the Bulgars, though, and was finally killed by the Pechenegs. This was a crucial moment. Russia existed but was still Viking, poised between Eastern and Western Christianity. Islam had been held back at the crucial period by the Khazaria, but Russia might have turned to the Latin West. Already the Slavs of Poland had been converted to Rome, and German bishoprics had been pushed forward to the east in the Baltic coastlands and Bohemia. The separation, even hostility, of the two great Christian churches was already a fact, and Russia was a great prize waiting for one of them. In 980, a series of dynastic struggles ended with the victorious emergence of the prince who made Russia Christian, Vladimir. It seems possible that he had been brought up as a Christian, but at first he showed the ostentatious paganism which became a Viking warlord. Then he began to inquire of other religions. Legend says that he had their different merits debated before them. Russians treasure the story that Islam was rejected by him because it forbade alcoholic drink. A commission was sent to visit the Christian churches. The Bulgarians, they reported, smelt. The Germans had nothing to offer, but Constantinople had won their hearts. There, they said in words often to be quoted, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or earth. For on earth there is no such vision nor beauty, and we do not know how to describe it. We know only that their God dwells among men." The choice was accordingly made. Around about 986 to 988, Vladimir accepted Orthodox Christianity for himself and his people. It was a turning point in Russian history and culture, as Orthodox churchmen have recognized ever since. Then the darkness of idolatry began to leave us, and the dawn of orthodoxy arose. Said one, eulogizing Vladimir a half-century or so later. Yet for all the zeal Vladimir showed in imposing baptism on his subjects by physical force if necessary, it was not only enthusiasm which influenced him. There were diplomatic dimensions to the choice too. Vladimir had been given military help to the emperor, and now he was promised a Byzantine princess as a bride. This was an unprecedented acknowledgement of the standing of a prince of Kiev. The emperor's sister was available because Byzantium needed the Rus alliance against the Bulgars. When things did not go smoothly, Vladimir put on the pressure by occupying Byzantine possessions in the Crimea. The marriage then took place. Kiev was worth a nuptial mass to Byzantium, though Vladimir's choice was decisive, of much more than diplomacy. 200 years later, his countrymen acknowledged this. Vladimir was canonized. He had made the single decision which, more than any other, determined Russia's future. Probably 10th century Kiev Rus had in many ways a richer culture than most of the Western Europe could offer. Its towns were important trading centers channeling goods into the Near East, where Russian furs and beeswax were prized. This commercial emphasis reflects another difference in Western Europe, the self-contained subsistence economy of the manor had emerged as an institution bearing the strain of the collapse of the classical economic world. Without the Western manor, Russia would also be without the Western feudal noblemen. A territorial aristocracy would take longer to emerge in Russia than in Catholic Europe. Russian nobles were for a long time to remain very much the companions and followers of the war leader. Some of them opposed Christianity and paganism held on in the north for decades. As in Bulgaria, the adoption of Christianity was a political act with internal as well as external dimension. And though the capital of a Christian principality, Kiev was not yet the center of a Christian nation. The monarchy had to assert itself against a conservative alliance of aristocracy and paganism. Lower down the social scale, in the towns, the new faith gradually took root. At first, thanks to the Bulgarian priests who brought with them the liturgy of the South Slav Church and the Cyrillic alphabet, which created Russian as literary language. Ecclesiastically, the influence of Byzantium was strong, and the metropolitan of Kiev was usually appointed by the Patriarch of Constantinople. Kiev became famous for the magnificence of its churches. It was a great time of building in a style showing Greek influence. Unhappily, being of wood, few of them have survived, but the repute of this artistic primacy reflects Kiev's wealth. Its apogee came under Yaroslav the Wise, when one Western visitor thought it rivaled Constantinople. Russia was then culturally as open to the outside world as it was ever to be for centuries. In part, this reflected Yaroslav's military and diplomatic standing. He exchanged diplomatic missions with Rome, with Novgorod, received the merchants of German Hanse. Having himself married a Swedish princess, he found husbands for the womenfolk of his family in kings of Poland, France, and Norway. A harried Anglo-Saxon royal family took refuge at his court. Links with the Western courts were never to be so close again. Culturally, too, the first fruits of the Byzantine implantation on Slav culture were being gathered. Educational foundation and legal creation reflected this. From this reign comes also one of the first great Russian works of literature, the primary chronicle, an interpretation of Russian history with a political purpose. Like much other early Christian history, it sought to provide a Christian and historical argument for what was already done by Christian princes, in this case the unification of Russia under Kiev. It stressed the Slav heritage and offered an account of Russian history in Christian terms. The weaknesses of Kiev Rus lay in the persistence of a rule of succession which almost guaranteed division and dispute at the death of the major prince. Though one other 11th century prince managed to assert his authority and hold foreign enemies at bay, the Kiev supremacy waned after Yaroslav. The northern princedoms showed greater autonomy. Moscow and Novgorod were eventually the two most important among them, though another grand princedom to match Kiev's was established at Vladimir's in the second half of the 13th century. In part, this shift of the center of gravity of Russia's history reflects a new threat to the south in the pressure of the Pechenegs, now reaching its peak. This was a momentous change. In these northern states, the beginning of future trends in Russian government and society can be discerned. Slowly, grants from the princess were transforming the old followers and boon companions of the warlord kings into a territorial nobility. Even settled peasants began to acquire rights of ownership and inheritance. Many of those who worked the land were slaves, but there was no such pyramid of obligation as shaped the territorial society of the medieval West. Yet these changes unrolled within a culture whose major direction had been settled by the Kiev period of Russian history. Another enduring national entity which began to crystallize at about the same time as Russia was Poland. Its origins lay in the group of Slav tribes who first appear in the historical record in the 10th century, struggling against pressure from the Germans in the West. It may well have been politics, therefore, that dictated the choice of Christianity as a religion by Poland's first historically recorded ruler, Mieszko I. The choice was not, as in Russia's case, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Mieszko plumped for Rome. Poland, therefore, would be linked throughout her history to the West as Russia would be to the East. This conversion in 966 opened a half-century of rapid consolidation for the new state. A vigorous successor began the creation of an administrative system and extended his lands to the Baltic in the north and through Silesia, Moravia, and Krakow in the west. One German emperor recognized his sovereignty in 1000, and in 1025 he was crowned King of Poland as Boleslav I. Political setbacks and pagan reactions dissipated much of what he had done, and there were grim times to come, but Poland was henceforth a historical reality. Moreover, three of the dominating themes of her history had also made their appearance: the struggle against German encroachment from the West, the identification with the interests of the Roman Church, and the factiousness and independence of the nobles towards the crown. The first two of these do much to account for Poland's unhappy history, for they tugged her in different directions. As Slavs, Poles guarded the glacis of the Slav world. They formed a breakwater against the tides of Teutonic immigration. As Catholics, they were the outposts of Western culture in its confrontation with the Orthodox East. During these confused centuries, other branches of the Slav peoples had been pushing on up the Adriatic and into Central Europe. From them emerged other nations with important futures. The Slavs of Bohemia and Moravia had in the 9th century been converted by Cyril and Methodius, but were then reconverted by Germans to Latin Christianity. The conflict of faiths was important too in Croatia and Serbia, where another branch settled and established states separated from Eastern Slav stocks, first by Avars and then by Germans and Magyars, whose invasions from the 9th century were especially important in cutting off Central European orthodoxy from Byzantine support. A Slav Europe therefore existed at the beginning of the 12th century. It was divided, it is true, by religion and into distinct areas of settlement. One of the peoples settled in it, the Magyars, who had crossed the Carpathians from the South Russia, were not Slav at all. The whole of the area was under growing pressure from the west, where politics, crusading zeal, and land hunger all made a drive to the eastern irresistibly attractive to Germans. The greatest Slav power, Kievan Russia, developed less than its full potential. It was handicapped by political fragmentation after the 11th century and harried in the next by the Cumans. By 1200, it had lost its control of the Black Sea river route. Russia had retreated to the north and was becoming Muscovy. Bad times for Slavs lay ahead. A hurricane of disasters was about to fall upon Slav Europe, and for that matter, on Byzantium. It was in 1204 that the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, and the world power which had sustained orthodoxy was eclipsed. Worse still was to come. 36 years later, the Christian city of Kiev fell to a terrible nomadic people. These were the Mongols.